Hello there. Tonight we are going to step barefoot into a frozen world. One with no heat, no shelter, no backup plan. You're not wrapped in a blanket. You're not under a roof. You're lying on a thin layer of fur inside a wind-battered cave while the wind howls like something hungry outside. Your nose is already numb. Your stomach's been empty for days and the fire is low, too low. And now you're giving birth. Welcome to your first night as a Neanderthal. You probably won't survive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. It all begins with the sound of breath, gasping, panting. A woman grits her teeth as another contraction grips her. And the cave, which normally echoes only the crackle of fire and the snores of the group, now fills with the unmistakable sound of pain. Birth in this age is neither miracle nor celebration, it's a gamble. There's no midwife, no hot towels, no understanding of breech positions or blood loss. Only experience maybe a sister who's done this before, or a mother who didn't die during hers. Maybe. Some women scream, others stay silent choosing not to waste breath, and some don't make a sound at all because they never get the chance to. Birth is the first brutal test, and it often ends in 2 deaths instead of 1. Yet sometimes, astonishingly, it goes right. A wailing bundle slips out into the icy air, sticky with blood and slick with instinct. The mother breathes, the baby cries, and the group looks on silently calculating whether this new mouth can be fed. Infant mortality among Neanderthals is estimated to have been over 50% ballers, and that's if the child survives the first week. There are no bottles, no mashed carrots, babies suckle on cracked frozen nipples, and mothers eat whatever scraps the hunters can provide. Sometimes it's mammoth meat, sometimes it's nothing. Malnutrition during nursing is a quiet killer. Even in the best case scenario, babies aren't coddled. They're swaddled in fur, strapped to their mothers, and carried from one hunting camp to the next. By 6 months, they're gnawing on bones. By 2, they're walking. By 4, they're expected to help gather. Childhood is not a protected phase of life. It's a short training montage for adulthood, if you get that far. Now, imagine the weather. This isn't your mild winter. This is Ice Age Europe. Temperatures could plummet to 40 degrees Wookiees at night. The snow doesn't fall gently, it slams into the ground. The wind doesn't whisper, it screams. One bad snowstorm could bury an entire family under a collapsed rock shelter. One slip on the ice could mean a snapped femur and no one's hiking 30 miles to a hospital. Clothing animal hides scraped and stitched by hand. Boots made from tendon and sinew. Nothing waterproof, everything stiff, everything fragile. If your shoe rips, your foot freezes. If your glove tears, your fingers turn black. Historians still debate whether Neanderthals had languages developed as ours, but they certainly didn't have a word for comfortable. The average lifespan, roughly 30 years, and if you made it to that age, chances are your bones were already telling a painful story. Healed fractures, arthritis, worn teeth, and joints that had been overused since childhood. Still in this chaotic world, some things were remarkably human. For instance, teeth. Neanderthal children developed teeth faster than modern humans. By the age of 3, they had a full set because their bodies didn't have time for delays. But what's strange is how many of those teeth were worn flat by age 12. Why? Because they weren't just chewing, they were using their teeth as tools, as clamps, as tiny vices to hold hides while scraping or to strip fibers into threads. Imagine a child holding a strip of rawhide in their mouth while tugging and pulling with both hands, learning from their mother how to make cord. You'd think they'd play with dolls, right? Not here. Oddly enough, there's even some evidence they like to decorate. Bits of bone and shell with holes pierced through them have been found near child-sized remains. Were they teething toys? Amulets, gifts? Who knows? But there's something oddly touching about a child chewing on a tiny seashell in a world of snow and predators. So let's say Somehow, you survive infancy, your bones grow dense, your muscles, even by modern gym rat standards, are ridiculous. You don't just look stocky, you are stocky. Neanderthals were barrel-chested, short-limbed, and built for brute cold endurance. It's not an aesthetic choice, it's survival. You don't have toys, you have tasks. Your play is practice learning how to hold a stone flake, without slicing your fingers learning how to walk, without falling into crevasses learning when not to touch the fire. And if you're thinking, surely they had lullabies, right? Well, maybe. We don't know. But we do know that some fossilized Neanderthal hyoid bones, the ones that anchor the tongue and help with speech, look a lot like ours. So maybe a mother whispered her child to sleep, or maybe it was just the wind howling through the cave and a heartbeat pressed close for warmth. Sometimes the most soothing lullaby is simply not dying that night. A curious fact, a Neanderthal burial site in France contains the remains of a child estimated to be under 5 years old, carefully laid in a shallow pit with tools and bones arranged around them. Someone grieved that loss. Someone took time in that world to honor a child who didn't make it. So yes, birth was brutal, childhood worse. But there were sparks, flickers of gentleness in a world that didn't allow much softness. In the next part, we'll step into the terrifying, freezing, bloody world of hunting. Because if being born was hard, feeding the tribe was worse. So, you've made it through infancy barely. Your bones are dense, your fingers are calloused, and your teeth already have grooves from scraping hide and grit. Now, you're somewhere around 10 or 12, which basically means you're of hunting age. No, not apprentice, not scout, you're joining the hunt. Let's be clear about what this means. You're not tiptoeing through a meadow tracking fluffy bunnies. You're helping take down 6-ton mammoths with spears made of sticks and stone. The spear is longer than you are, the mammoth taller than a city bus. And it does not want to be stabbed. Its kill or be crushed. And the worst part, it isn't optional. If the hunt fails, the group doesn't eat. And if the group doesn't eat, someone dies, usually the smallest, the weakest, or the slowest to warm up by the fire. That might mean your little brother, or your grandmother, or next time you. Hunting was the heartbeat of Neanderthal life. It wasn't a weekend activity, it was every day, all the time, or at least as often as your wounds allowed. These weren't leisurely strolls through the forest with a bow and arrow. In fact, they didn't have bows. Historians still debate whether Neanderthals used thrown spears at all or just thrust them at close range. Either way, we know this: they got close. Uncomfortably close. Let's talk targets. Mammoths, of course. Their meat could feed a group for weeks, their hides made shelters, and their bones served as beams and tools. But mammoths didn't just stand there and let themselves get harvested. They charged, they trampled. Their tusks, up to 16 feet long, could turn a hunter into a memory with one swing. There were woolly rhinoceroses too, because apparently hunting one giant murder animal wasn't enough. The rhinos were unpredictable, quick-tempered, and equipped with horns that made kebabs out of anyone standing in the wrong place. And don't forget the cave bears. Yes, they lived in the caves. Your caves. Your shelter from the storm could double as a grisly Airbnb, and these guys didn't like guests. 10 feet tall on their hind legs, claws like carving knives, and very, very territorial. Now picture the hunt. The group crouched in silence near a snow-covered ridge. The reindeer herd moves below, hooves crunching faintly. You feel your toes freezing inside your fur-wrapped sandals. Your breath fogs the air, and you don't dare speak. Someone gives a hand signal, primitive but understood. And suddenly everyone moves. It's not elegant, it's not choreographed, it's chaos with a plan. Some hunters try to panic the herd toward a cliff edge. Others ambush from brush or rocks. The idea is to get the animals to run fast, wild, and in the right direction, which, as you can imagine, doesn't always happen. A stampede in the wrong direction means broken legs, crushed skulls, and days of recovery if you're lucky, or one very hasty burial if you're not. The technique of running herds off cliffs, yes, that was a thing. Archaeological digs have found piles of animal bones at the base of cliffs, sometimes hundreds at a time. But that kind of success took planning terrain, knowledge, and coordination. And even when it worked, getting down to the carcasses and processing them before predators arrived, another nightmare entirely. And the weapons. Let's talk about those gorgeous but deadly Levallois points. These were stone spearheads carefully knapped from flint or chert. They weren't just random shards, they were symmetrical, sharp, and aerodynamic in their own heavy Neanderthal way. Shaping one took hours. You sat with your core stone, chipping it in precise angles, watching flakes fall like snow until you had something capable of piercing hide muscle and maybe even bone. We're talking about prehistoric weaponry that if you dropped it in a modern museum and didn't label it, someone might mistake for a piece of contemporary sculpture. That's how elegant they could be. But remember, no matter how perfect, your spear, it still had to be used. Which meant getting close enough to stab something with tusks or fangs, and it meant trusting the people beside you not to hesitate, not to panic, and not to trip. Historians still debate how coordinated Neanderthal hunting parties really were. Some argue that they used sophisticated group tactics, while others believe it was more opportunistic ambush chase, stab, and prey. What's certain is that their survival depended on working together. Even the strongest hunter couldn't take down a mammoth alone. And here's an odd fact to chew on literally. Some Neanderthal tools have wear patterns that suggest they processed hides with their teeth. That's right. After killing and skinning the prey, some steps in the tanning process involved holding hide in the mouth and pulling it with the hands to soften and stretch it. So yes, their jaws weren't just for chewing, they were survival tools. Back at camp, the work didn't end. Butchering a mammoth was an all-hands-on-deck situation. The meat had to be sliced, dried, or cooked. The bones cracked open for marrow. The hide stretched, scraped, and dried into clothing or tent coverings. The tusks might be carved into tools or even art. Nothing went to waste. Waste wasn't a concept. And then came the part no one talks about: the weight. What if no mammoth showed up? What if every reindeer was too fast? What if the hunters came back limping and empty-handed? That's when things got dark, real dark. Roots, bark, bugs, scavenged bones from predator kills. And sometimes, other Neanderthals. There's physical evidence of cannibalism, cut marks on bones, cracked skulls, signs of butchery. Was it ritual or just desperate hunger? Historians still debate that too. But when you're starving in the snow and someone dies, whether from injury, sickness, or cold, the line between burial and butchery might blur. Let's not forget this wasn't occasional hunger. This was constant hunger. Neanderthals needed a lot of calories. Their stocky muscular bodies burned through food like wood in a campfire. When the hunts failed, starvation followed quickly, and starvation was indiscriminate. It didn't matter if you were the best toolmaker, the sweetest child, or the group's spiritual leader. If the hunt failed for long enough, everyone suffered. Yet somehow they kept doing it. Again and again, they ran after mammoths and rhinos with sharpened sticks. They faced cave bears to claim shelter. They risked death for food every single week of their lives. And they did it with teamwork, with ritual, and sometimes miraculously with success. So, when you lay in your warm bed tonight, maybe with snacks and streaming services nearby, try to imagine being 12 years old, holding a spear that smells like fire and sweat, staring into the eyes of an animal that wants you very dead. And just remember, hunger doesn't wait. It doesn't care how tired you are. Next up, we'll talk about the quieter violence, the kind that hides in bones, in bruises, in the painful silence after a blow. The mammoth is dead. The tribe feasts, the fire is warm, and yet your ribs still hurt. You didn't fall. You didn't get gored. You got elbowed. Hard. By someone in your own group, someone who didn't want to share the marrow. Or maybe the fire spot. Or maybe they just don't like you. They're stronger, bigger, older. And out here, that's enough. This is what we mean when we talk about the quiet violence. The kind that doesn't come from predators or icy storms, but from inside the shelter, from your own people, from those who are supposed to protect you. Life in a Neanderthal group wasn't some prehistoric group hug. It was survival by cooperation, yes, but also survival by dominance. And that dominance could turn brutal. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of Neanderthal skeletons, and if those bones could talk, they'd tell stories of constant trauma. Healed fractures, cracked skulls, arms broken and then broken again. Some bones even show signs of being struck by blunt objects, not from hunting accidents or falls, but from other humans. Historians still debate how common interpersonal violence was. But here's what's undeniable. A disturbing number of Neanderthal remains have multiple traumatic injuries, some of which couldn't have healed without care. That means not only were they getting hurt regularly, they were surviving it barely. Let's talk head trauma. One study found that Neanderthals were twice as likely to suffer serious head injuries as later Homo sapiens. Some of that was from hunting close-range prey. Yes, mammoths fight back, but not all of it. Some skull fractures line up a little too well with the sort of trauma you'd expect from a fight. Not a brawl, a beatdown. Why? Because small groups under stress don't always resolve conflict with a group discussion and a talking stick. You want a mate? Someone else might already have her. You want food? There's not enough. You think the leader is weak. Well, congratulations. Now you're both bleeding. The social unit of a Neanderthal group was tiny, usually around 15 to 30 people. That's barely enough to form 2 baseball teams, let alone maintain genetic diversity or emotional stability. And when you live that close in that much cold for that long tempest flare, there's an odd fact for you. Some Neanderthal bones show healed injuries, so extreme broken spines, crushed limbs that the people must have been carried fed and protected for months or even years. The community didn't kill them. In fact, someone stayed up at night to tend the fire and change their bandages. So here's the contradiction. These people could be unbelievably violent and also unbelievably compassionate. The same man who shoved you away from the fire might save your life tomorrow. The woman who fought for a reindeer thigh might bring you water when you're too feverish to sit up, because survival required both. Cooperation wasn't a luxury. It was an evolutionary strategy, but so was competition, so was dominance. If you weren't strong, cunning, or protected by kinship ties, you might end up outside the cave the next time food ran low. No spoken trial, no written laws, just a long look, a heavy silence, and maybe a pile of broken tools outside to signal that you've worn out your welcome. Historians still debate whether Neanderthal groups had formal hierarchies, but the injuries and the patterns suggest that someone was in charge, and that someone was likely the biggest, strongest, and most aggressive member of the group. Now imagine you're that leader. You have to keep people fed, keep rival groups away, manage injuries, manage egos, and still go out hunting. Your authority is based on competence, not charisma. If you make too many mistakes, you don't get impeached. You get challenged. Some of the most serious injuries we find in Neanderthal skeletons are concentrated in the upper body, arms, shoulders, skulls, suggesting hand-to-hand combat. Close, brutal, decisive, and yes, sometimes fatal. If that wasn't enough, the stress of everyday life left its mark in more subtle ways too. Bone stress markers, tiny lines in teeth that form during periods of malnutrition, show that most Neanderthals suffered multiple bouts of starvation in childhood. Their skeletons carry signs of early onset arthritis, and many of them had massive buildup around the knees and hips, suggesting they were walking or crouching on rough terrain, constantly probably in pain. Oddly enough, some of their teeth were worn down evenly, almost like sandpaper. That's because they use their teeth to grip and hold things, leather sinew branches, often more than their fingers. Imagine using your molars like pliers. Now picture the consequences: chipped enamel, exposed nerves, constant pain, no dentist, no numbing gel, just fire, heated rocks, and willpower. And then there's the element of silence. Because how do you talk about pain when your language might not even have words for it? There are no records of Neanderthal speech, obviously, but based on brain size, hyoid bone structure, and auditory canal shape, scientists believe they had some form of vocal communication. It probably wasn't Shakespearean dialogue, more likely a mixture of vocalizations, gestures, and facial cues, maybe even some proto-words. But therapy not a thing. If you were hurting, you kept moving. If you were afraid, you kept quiet. If you wanted to survive, you endured. That's not to say they didn't comfort each other. A hand on a shoulder, a shared piece of meat, a blanket of fur laid across a shivering body. These were the gestures of love, subtle, unspoken, and often overlooked by archaeologists who prefer bones to emotions. Still, it's not hard to imagine the ache of isolation, the sting of being left out of a hunt, the pain of watching someone else eat while you chew on leather. Because sometimes the worst violence wasn't physical, it was social. Being excluded, being forgotten, being alone. That could kill you just as fast as a saber-tooth. So yes, Neanderthals were violent, but not in the caricatured club-wielding brute way. Their violence was more intimate, more human, fueled by fear, by need, by desperation. It was the kind of violence that still exists today in boardrooms, backrooms, and bad relationships, just with fewer tusks. Next, we'll enter the season that turned even the strongest Neanderthals into ghosts, the long, relentless, bone-deep cold. Winter isn't coming. It never left. The fire is low again. Not because no one's tending it, but because there's no more wood. You burned the last of the dry roots last night, and the nearest grove is miles away, buried under frozen soil and a half-foot of snow. The cave walls creak, the wind outside howls like it's hungry. Your breath curls white in the air, even this close to the flames. Welcome to winter in the Ice Age. No matter what else the Neanderthals faced, starvation, predators, injuries, nothing was as constant as slow and as silently lethal as the cold. It wasn't a season. It was a presence. And it wasn't always obvious. It didn't knock you over with a single gust, it just waited. Creeping into your bones, numbing your fingers, tightening its grip with each shorter day, each frozen morning, each step across wind-scoured plains where no animals dared tread and nothing grew. Historians still debate whether Neanderthals truly mastered winter survival or merely endured it. But what we do know is they faced conditions that would break the average modern human within days. We're talking about average winter temperatures dipping below 30 degrees C. Arctic winds slicing through even the thickest mammoth hide cloak. Snowstorms that didn't just dust the landscape but buried it. Weeks without sunlight, months without reliable food. And unlike us, they couldn't huddle inside heated homes, sipping cocoa. They had caves, if they were lucky. Not all Neanderthals lived in caves. Many built windbreaks out of mammoth bones and hides staked with wooden supports and packed with snow or mud. Think igloos, but heavier. Cruder, more temporary. These shelters worked barely, but in bad years, even the best of them collapsed. Or froze shut, or got claimed by bears. And even inside these makeshift homes, warmth was never a given. A fire required fuel. Fuel meant foraging. Foraging meant exposure. Every trip outside was a calculus of risk. Do you send the old man whose lungs wheeze in the cold, or the young boy who's small but fast? Do you go yourself knowing your frostbitten toe still hasn't healed from last week's run? Because no fire means no warmth, and no warmth means someone doesn't wake up. Odd fact, some Neanderthal hearths had fire pits built with concentric circles of heated stone, primitive insulation systems. These weren't just bonfires, they were carefully managed, constantly maintained, and fiercely protected. A fire was life. So was clothing. But don't imagine neatly stitched coats and cozy fur hats. Imagine layers of stiff, scratchy hide scraped by hand, sewn with bone needles and tendon thread. It wasn't fashionable. It wasn't breathable. It was heavy and exhausting to wear, and sometimes still not enough. The fur cracked, the seams split, the boots leaked, and if your clothes failed in the middle of a blizzard, that was it. You were done. There's archaeological evidence that it took the hides of up to 7 animals to make a single winter outfit. That means 7 successful hunts, not counting the meat waste or damaged skins. One tear in your leggings might represent weeks of lost effort. Still, they made do. Neanderthals had wide nasal passages possibly evolved to humidify and warm freezing air. Their stocky builds helped retain heat. Their short limbs minimized frostbite risk. Evolution gave them armor. But even that had limits. Hypothermia doesn't discriminate. Picture a typical night. A family group of 20 huddled inside a cave. The fire glows orange. The air stinks of smoke meat and sweat-soaked hide. There's barely room to stretch your legs. Outside, the wind whips past the cave mouth. Snow sifts in with every gust. Someone coughs. Someone else snores. You stare at the flickering shadows on the ceiling, counting the moments between each snap of the wood, each wheeze of breath. If you sleep too soundly, the fire might die. If you let the fire die, you all might die. And so the group takes turns. Someone's always awake, feeding the flame, watching the cave mouth, listening for the snarl of predators or the shift of snow on the ledge above. Because avalanches were real. Cave-ins too. Winter was the long test, not a sudden disaster but a drawn-out siege. Days of hunger, nights of cold, weeks of nothing to hunt, nothing to gather, nothing to do but survive. Some years it worked. The dried meat held out. The hides stayed patched. The snow melted eventually. Other years you could almost smell the dying in the air. Historians still debate whether Neanderthal groups migrated south during the harshest winters or tried to hunker down. But evidence from southern Europe, Spain, Italy, the Balkans suggests some groups retreated to lower elevations. Others didn't make it. Some simply vanished. Entire valleys emptied of signs. Camps left mid-meal. Tools scattered like someone had dropped them mid-task and walked away, or never had the chance to. It wasn't just the cold, it was what the cold brought. Frozen rivers, starving wolves, predators driven closer to human territory in search of easy kills, disease sparked by too many people packed in too little space, smoke inhalation from closed-up shelters. And maybe worst of all, the psychological grind. There's a kind of madness that comes with too many dark days and too few hours of light. We feel it now. Imagine how it felt then, with no clocks, no books, no distractions. Just the endless snow and the flicker of firelight on stone. Neanderthals may not have had a word for despair, but they knew what it meant. You could hear it in the silence, in the mother who stopped humming, in the elder who stopped complaining, in the child who wouldn't cry even when burned. And yet, they kept going. They told stories. They sang, probably. They carved grooves into bone, maybe to count days, or just to pass the time. They played occasionally. Evidence suggests children had favorite tools, or even small carved figures. These weren't just survival robots. They were people, trapped in winter, just like we sometimes are. So when you wake up tomorrow and complain that the floor is cold, think of this. You could have been waking up to a cave ceiling coated in frost, to breathless lungs, to frozen hands, to no guarantee that your group was still breathing. Because in Ice Age Europe, winter didn't play around. It stayed. Next, we'll talk about what kept them alive through those frigid nights, what they guarded more fiercely than food. Fire. That flickering, smoky miracle that meant life and death and everything in between. The fire crackles in the corner of the cave, more ember than flame now. Someone stirs from sleep, fumbling with half-frozen fingers to feed it another branch. It's not just a chore. It's survival. Because in the Neanderthal world, fire wasn't an accessory. It was sacred. Without fire, you didn't cook your food. You didn't warm your body. You didn't keep the predators at bay. You didn't live. Neanderthals knew this, and they treated fire accordingly. Let's start with something basic. Fire doesn't just appear. You have to make it, keep it, guard it. And that's no small feat when the air outside can freeze water in minutes, and your only materials are damp sticks, brittle moss, and maybe a half-burned pine branch from yesterday's camp. Historians still debate whether Neanderthals could start fire from scratch like using friction or striking sparks from flint and pyrite, or whether they relied on catching fire from the natural sources like lightning strikes, then keeping it alive as long as possible. Either way, they were masters of tending flame once it started. They built hearths deep inside caves, places where the wind couldn't reach. They lined their fire pits with stone, sometimes in multiple layers, to insulate and reflect heat. Some even dug shallow troughs around the flame, channeling runoff and protecting embers from stray drips of melting snow or ice. And yes, they managed smoke. In many shelters, soot stains still mark the ceiling's dark patches that tell you someone was paying attention to airflow, to where the smoke went, to how not to asphyxiate the group while cooking mammoth steaks. It wasn't cozy, it was complicated. Fire didn't just cook food, it transformed it. A burned marrow bone yields more accessible fat. Roasting meat makes it more digestible. Smoking strips preserves them, sort of. And all of this was critical when food was scarce, and nutrition made the difference between growing stronger or growing dead. You needed the calories, you needed the warmth, you needed fire. But you also needed someone to keep it going. Imagine that responsibility. You're the firekeeper tonight. The others are curled up under stiff hides, breathing in unison, bodies pressed close. Outside, a blizzard screams down the ridge. You're kneeling over a dwindling flame, eyes half closed, face scorched on one side and frozen on the other. You can't let it go out. There's no lighter, no matches, no just restart it. If you let the fire die and no one finds flame, the next morning the group doesn't argue with you. They leave you. Or worse, they blame you. Odd fact. Traces of birch bark tar have been found at Neanderthal sites, a sticky black substance made by heating bark in low oxygen conditions. It has antiseptic properties, but more importantly, it burns. Think of it as the world's first fire starter. They made it themselves. That's not just practical, that's chemistry. So firekeeping wasn't just warmth, it was knowledge. And it may have belonged to someone specific, maybe the oldest member of the group, or maybe a child too small to hunt, but old enough to stay awake. Someone who sat beside the flames every night, adding twigs, blowing gently, listening for the soft hiss of dying heat. One of the strangest things about fire in the Neanderthal world, it gathered people. Think about it. Out in the open, everyone spread out, hunting, foraging, watching the perimeter. But at night, fire draws you in. It narrows the world to a flickering ring of light and warmth. That's where stories live. Historians still debate the extent of Neanderthal language, but even without complex grammar, even without poetry, they likely had rhythm, repetition, sound. They could share memory, share warnings, maybe even jokes. Sitting by the fire, the group may have recounted hunts past on survival tips or taught the little ones how to shape flint. They might have sung croaky, wordless lullabies. They might have carved tools, talismans, notches in bone. Something to do with the hands while the mind wandered. And maybe they found comfort. But let's not romanticize it too much. Sometimes the fire was not comforting. Sometimes it was a source of fear. An accidental spark could catch on fur or thatched walls. There was no fire extinguisher. Only shouts. Only dirt. Only loss. Some sites show burn layers where an entire settlement may have gone up in flames. Not just once. Multiple times. So fire was both protector and threat. Like a wild animal you invited inside hoping it stayed tame. And of course, fire kept the other animals away. Cave lions, hyenas, dire wolves. Most predators feared fire. Its scent, its flicker, its unfamiliar heat. Neanderthals took full advantage. They didn't just sit near it. They lined their camps with it. Archaeological digs show multiple hearths arranged in rough circles like glowing sentries. Combined with sharpened stakes, high ground, and vigilance fire helped hold the darkness back. But only barely. Every Neanderthal family knew at least one story of the night the fire failed. Maybe it was a collapsed hearth. Maybe the wind was too strong. Maybe someone fell asleep. One moment of lapse and suddenly the shelter goes dark. The wind surges in. And then footsteps. Heavy. Cautious. Not human. You don't scream. You grab whatever weapon you can. You hope the spark catches quickly. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. In one cave, bones of both humans and cave lions were found side by side in chaotic scatter, suggesting a violent shared end. And near the fire pit, burnt bones. Some human. Whether that was defense or desperation, we'll never know. But we do know this fire kept the night away. And Neanderthals, for all their power, feared the night. It swallowed you. Silently, without mercy. And so they guarded the flames not just for warmth but for life. Next, we'll peer into that darkness, beyond the glow of firelight, into the forests and valleys where predators watched and waited. Eyes in the dark, teeth in the snow. You're staring into the fire again, half hypnotized by the flicker. The warmth barely reaches your toes, and the hide wrapped around your shoulders still smells like smoke, wet fur, and blood. But that's not what's keeping you awake. It's the sound. Just at the edge of the cave mouth, a crunch, a snort, then silence. Something is out there. Welcome to the part of the story that Neanderthals knew better than we ever will, the predators. You see, Neanderthals weren't just hunters, they were also prey. Despite their strength, their tools, and their fire, they shared their world with monsters, real ones, the kind that wouldn't look out of place in a horror movie. Let's start with the cave lion, bigger than modern African lions. Longer, heavier, meaner, and with no fear of humans. Males could weigh over 700 pounds and stretch nearly 11 feet from nose to tail. Their fangs weren't just for show, they were designed to crush bone. These beasts didn't just live out in the forest. They wanted the same thing you wanted: shelter, warmth, safety, which meant the same caves Neanderthals used to raise their children and cook their food. Yeah, cave lions used them too. There are claw marks on stone walls that are still visible today, massive deep gouges left by paws the size of dinner plates. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal bones inside those same caves, fractured in ways that match lion attacks. Historians still debate how often these two species clashed, but let's just say they didn't co-sign the lease peacefully. Then there were the short-faced bears. If you've never heard of them, don't feel bad, most people haven't. They went extinct, and honestly, good riddance. These things were terrifying, standing 12 feet tall on their hind legs, weighing more than a ton, and built for speed. Yes, speed. They could run over 40 kilometers per hour. Imagine a grizzly on stilts with the appetite of a shark and the sprinting ability of a sprinter. You're not climbing a tree to escape. They just pull you down. And they were carnivores, not scavengers, not mostly herbivore with a side of aggression, just flat-out meat seekers. Now imagine you're 6 years old, dozing in the corner of the cave, and you hear that low guttural snort. You don't know what it is, but the adults do. One grabs a burning branch, another reaches for a spear. No one says a word, because noise doesn't scare predators. Fire might. And if the fire's out, you pray. Or whatever passed for praying back then. Maybe you just held your breath and didn't move. Odd fact. Some Neanderthal sites show signs of reinforced cave entrances, boulders stacked sharpened stakes jammed into crevices. It's like they were building doors. Or traps. Not for prey, for predators. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Hyenas were another problem, bigger and more aggressive than their modern cousins. These weren't just scavengers laughing in the background. They hunted in packs, they circled camps, they watched from the shadows. And they waited. They were smart too. Adaptable. Some evidence suggests they learned to associate Neanderthal camps with food scraps, or with easy kills, especially when the group was weak, injured, or split. The bones of Neanderthal children have been found with bite marks matching hyena jaws, clean, calculated punctures. These weren't accidents, these were ambushes. Historians still debate how organized Neanderthal defense strategies were, but one thing's certain: someone always had to be on guard. Night watch wasn't a choice, it was a sentence. Your eyes stung from smoke, your ears rang with wind, and you had to stay awake, not for fun, but to keep the group alive. Some predators were small, but no less deadly. Wolverines, for instance, tiny compared to cave bears, but absolute nightmares in their own right. Ferocious, fearless, and prone to attack anything that looked even slightly vulnerable. And then there were the leopards. Sleek, silent, deadly. They could climb trees, scale rock faces, and drop silently into your camp from above. There's evidence that leopards hunted Neanderthal children while they slept, dragging them off into the dark. In one shocking discovery, a Neanderthal skull was found in a leopard den with puncture marks neatly aligned to its canines. No trial, no chance, just gone. And wolves. Wolves were different. Wolves were complicated. They hunted in packs, of course. But they also watched, followed, waited, and maybe partnered. Some researchers believe that the early relationship between humans and wolves may have started during this period with wary cooperation, shared scraps, shared kills, a mutual understanding. It's just a theory, but it's a nice one. Still, before any loyal canine companions, wolves were a threat. A hungry pack could overwhelm a sleeping group within minutes, especially if the fire was low, especially if someone was injured, especially if it had been days since the last hunt. Now you might be wondering, why didn't they just leave? The caves build huts in the open. Some did, but caves offered the most protection. Thick walls, a roof, a single entrance to God. And if you were lucky, a deep enough recess to hide the young and the sick. Still, even the best cave was a gamble. You weren't locking a door, you were hoping that tonight the predators were full or elsewhere, or scared enough of fire and spear tips to leave your group alone, because once one crept past the threshold, once it was inside, your odds dropped to almost zero. So Neanderthals learned to listen differently. Every crack of a twig outside, every gust of wind, every shift of the fire's light. They were aware in ways we've long forgotten. Your heartbeat had to sync with the dark. Your breath had to slow until even your scent was hard to trace, because anything that noticed you breathing might decide to make you stop. And yet, they didn't give up. They didn't pack it in, say, this planet's a nightmare and disappear. They stood watch. They guarded the caves. They fought back. They lived, because that's what Neanderthals did. They endured the monsters, not just in myth, but with claws and fangs and glowing eyes, and they stayed alive night after night, season after season. In the next section, we turn to something just as dangerous, but somehow even more complicated: reproduction. Love, sex, birth, pain, and choices no human should ever have to make. So, you've survived the winter, dodged the predators, kept the fire alive. Your bones are whole, your group intact for now. But survival isn't just about tonight. It's about tomorrow and the next generation. Which means somebody's got to have kids. Ah yes, love in the Ice Age. Except it wasn't romantic, not in the way we think of it. There were no candlelit dinners, no whispered sonnets, and definitely no dating apps. Just fur, firelight, and the endless push of biology demanding reproduce or disappear. Historians still debate the social structures around Neanderthal mating. Were they monogamous, polygamous? Did they have mating rituals or arranged pairings? No one knows for sure. But judging by the DNA evidence and burial patterns, there's one thing we can say. Relationships were pragmatic. If you were of breeding age and you could survive childbirth or contribute to child rearing, you were in the game, whether you liked it or not. And for women, that game was brutal. Imagine being 15 or 16, already marked by years of cold hunger, and maybe a fractured rib from last season's cave bear incident, and now you're pregnant. Congratulations. Childbirth was one of the deadliest experiences in Neanderthal life. No medicine, no midwives, no understanding of germs. The pelvic structure of Neanderthal women suggests that birth was slightly easier than it is for modern humans, but only slightly. The babies still had huge heads. The process still involved massive blood loss. An infection afterward was almost inevitable. Odd fact, Neanderthal mothers gave birth lying upright, or squatting not flat. That was probably more efficient, but still terrifying. And if you made it through labor, your work had only just begun. Feeding a newborn meant keeping your body alive enough to make milk in a season when your diet might consist of pine bark, smoked lizard, and half-frozen marrow. There were no swaddling blankets, just hides, no bottles, no baby books. Your infant might start teething before their first birthday, and that means chewing. And that means soft meat gnawed bones, bits of roasted tuber, maybe mashed insect paste if you're lucky. If not, tough luck. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high, possibly above 50%, and even those who made it past infancy weren't safe. A broken leg, a lung infection, one careless moment near the fire, one hungry predator, one group argument that turned violent. Because make no mistake, babies didn't guarantee protection. If your group was starving and the baby cried too loud, that sound could draw predators or rival groups, and people made choices, dark ones. Historians still debate how often Neanderthals practiced infanticide or abandonment. There's no clear evidence either way, but in a world where calories meant survival and every extra mouth mattered, the possibility hangs heavy. Not that it was heartless. Archaeological sites show that when children died, whether from illness, injury, or exposure, they were buried with care. Tools, beads, and flowers have been found alongside tiny skeletons. That's not disposal, that's grief. Now let's talk about sex carefully. In Neanderthal society, sex wasn't hidden or taboo the way it is in many modern cultures. It was survival. It was transaction. It was reproduction, plain and painful. Pair bonding probably existed. You see it in the way some graves have couples buried side by side. But fidelity, romantic affection, that's unclear. What's more likely is that sexual access was linked to status and power. If you were the best hunter or the one who controlled fire, or the one who protected the group from predators, you had leverage. And if you were lower in the pecking order, especially a woman or adolescent, you had fewer choices. There's no polite way to say this sexual violence was probably common. Not because Neanderthals were evil or primitive, but because in a world without laws, without social contracts, and without protections, force often replaced consent. And the line between choice and coercion gets blurry when everyone's trying not to die. This isn't easy to hear, but it's part of their reality. And yet amidst the harshness, there are flickers of care. Some groups buried mothers and infants together, cradled in the fetal position. Some buried pregnant women with beads and pigments. Some buried fathers beside their children, arm bones interlocked. They cared. They didn't just breed, they bonded. They raised their children as long as they could. They taught them to walk, to hold a tool, to stay low in the grass while tracking prey. A child who survived to age 6 was already part of the team, gathering berries, carrying firewood, running messages between adults, practicing with toy spears carved by hand. By 10, they were real hunters. There's a tenderness in that oddly familiar. Parents leaning down to correct a grip, children copying their father's crouch, a big sister carrying a baby brother on her back during a migration. And sure, there were rivalries, jealousies, fights over mates and fire spots. But there was also something else, legacy. They didn't know the word, but they lived it. To pass on genes wasn't just biology. It was proof that your group had made it another season, another decade, another generation. And maybe in their own way they celebrated that. A girl reaching maturity might receive a necklace of fox teeth. A boy's first kill might earn him a painted face. Rituals small and rough and firelit, not for beauty, but for meaning. Odd fact, some Neanderthal tools were engraved, scratched deliberately with no functional purpose. Why, we don't know. But maybe, just maybe, they were marks of memory, of family, of children lost, of love remembered. Because that's the contradiction again. This was a world of pain, blood, and frostbite. And yet, love found a way in. Next, we'll follow what happened when love couldn't save you. When illness came. When pain never left, when the only medicine was a hand on your shoulder and maybe some moss stuffed into a wound, the cough starts small, a tight little wheeze behind the ribs. You ignore it, everyone does. The air's full of smoke from the fire and it's always cold anyway. Coughing isn't a symptom, it's background noise. Until it doesn't stop, until it wakes people in the night, until the one who was coughing can't sit up anymore. Welcome to disease in the Neanderthal world. There were no clinics, no herbs you could brew into comfort, no one with a chart and a diagnosis, just symptoms and the creeping dread that once a body started to break down, it probably wasn't coming back. Let's start with the basics. Colds, pneumonia infections fatal. What you or I would treat with soup sleep or a couple pills could easily spiral into a death sentence for a Neanderthal. Their caves were cramped, their fire pits, while life-saving, filled the air with constant smoke. Ventilation was a dream. And during winter, everyone huddled close, sharing warmth, breath, and bacteria. Historians still debate how widespread disease was among Neanderthals, especially epidemic-level illness. But individual infections, those were constant. Odd fact, some Neanderthal ribs show thickening from chronic lung disease, possibly from years of breathing smoky air, maybe worsened by cold exposure and mold from damp caves. Now let's talk wounds. You're hunting, you trip on ice. The spear goes through your thigh, the bone cracks, you scream, someone drags you back. But what next? There's no antiseptic, no stitches, no splint unless someone improvises with wood and tendon. And even if they do, the wound might fester. It might fill with pus. It might attract flies, or it might just never heal. Archaeological remains show countless examples of broken bones that healed. Incorrectly twisted femurs, lopsided arms, shattered kneecaps, refused in crooked ways. You lived with a limp, with pain, with reduced ability, and that was if you lived at all. Dental problems were another nightmare. Neanderthals used their teeth like tools, gripping hides, softening sinew, holding fibers. This wore them down early. Flat molars, chipped incisors, and once infection set in, there was no escape. Tooth abscesses could swell the face, spread to the brain, kill silently. Imagine trying to eat tough mammoth meat with a rotting molar, or sleeping with a throbbing jaw while the wind howls through the cave. Some did survive these ailments, but it wasn't luck, it was care. That's the part people miss despite having no medicine. Neanderthals didn't always abandon their sick. In fact, many archaeological finds suggest the opposite. Take the famous case of Shanida 1. A Neanderthal man found in Iraq who lived into his 40s despite being partially blind, crippled, and suffering from multiple severe injuries, including a withered arm. He wouldn't have lasted a week alone. But someone fed him, protected him, cleaned his wounds. That's not efficiency, that's compassion, maybe even love. And this isn't an isolated case. One skeleton from France belonged to a man with no teeth. He lived for years. Like that, someone chewed his food for him. Think about that. In a world where calories were everything, where food was sacred, someone gave up time and energy just to keep one man alive. Historians still debate whether this care was social, spiritual, or emotional. Was he a respected elder, a shaman, a burden? We don't know, but someone kept him alive anyway. Now let's go darker parasites. Yes, even in the Ice Age, people had worms. Coprolites, fossilized feces tell us that Neanderthals suffered from intestinal parasites. Roundworms, tapeworms, maybe worse. These weren't just gross. They caused chronic malnutrition, weakness, anemia, and pain. Imagine waking up already exhausted. Your muscles ache, your joints hurt, and you haven't eaten in a day. But the real reason you're weak, a colony of worms stealing your nutrients from the inside. There's even evidence of lice and fleas, persistent little vampires that would have infested hides, bedding, and hair. No hot baths, no delousing shampoos, just itching, irritation, and transmission of other diseases. And then there's scurvy. A diet too heavy in meat, too low in fresh plant matter, could lead to vitamin C deficiency, bleeding gums, weak bones, immune collapse. Neanderthal remains show porous bone patterns that suggest this disease may have plagued them, especially during long winters when foraging wasn't an option. Oddly enough, traces of medicinal plants have been found in their dental calculus calcified plaque. Yarrow, chamomile, both with anti-inflammatory properties. Birch bark too, which contains salicylic acid, basically aspirin. They didn't understand why these plants worked, but they used them anyway. That hints at something remarkable. Observation. Maybe they saw a sick animal eating a certain root and mimicked it. Maybe they noticed that some plants soothed pain or eased fever. Either way, it wasn't random. It was survival. And when all else failed, they still buried their dead. Not dumped, not forgotten, buried. Sometimes with grave goods, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with others nearby forming what looks like family plots. Even in death, there was intention. So while disease ravaged Neanderthal communities and pain was constant, they weren't just victims. They adapted, they endured, they cared. They didn't have doctors, but they had each other. And in the darkest nights, when the cough grew worse, when the wounds smelled foul, when a child shivered endlessly in their mother's arms, someone still held a hand, still sat beside the fire, still stayed up long after the others slept. Because even then, in that world, compassion mattered. In the next section, we'll explore something surprising. Neanderthals weren't just survivors. They were thinkers, artists maybe, storytellers. They left behind more than bones. They left behind beauty. So far, we've trudged through snowdrifts, survived cave lion attacks, gutted mammoths, buried children, and coughed through pneumonia beside a smoldering fire pit. It's been grim. But tonight, let's follow a different trail. One not marked by blood and ash, but by wonder. Because Neanderthals didn't just live in this brutal world. They noticed it, shaped it, responded to it with meaning and creativity. They made art. Yes, really, art. Not crude scratches or random doodles, but deliberate mark symbols, patterns, and perhaps feelings pressed into stone. Historians still debate the extent of Neanderthal cognitive capacity. Were they truly thinking like us? Or were their creations just instinctive patterns? But whatever the motivation, the evidence is clear these ancient cousins weren't just surviving. They were reflecting. Let's start with the cave art in Spain. In a dark, winding chamber far from daylight, Neanderthals left behind red ochre hand stencils on the walls, created by placing their palms against the rock and blowing pigment around them. What does that mean? Maybe it was a signature, a territorial claim, a ritual. Or maybe it was a way of saying, I was here. Imagine the scene. A flickering fire in a cave's belly, shadows dancing across the walls. Someone dips a reed into red powder, holds a hand steady against the cold stone, and exhales pigment into the darkness. A breath captured forever. Odd fact, these markings predate the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe. So they weren't borrowed or copied, they were Neanderthal originals. And they weren't alone. Neanderthals created personal adornment beads made from animal teeth, eagle talons, seashells with bored holes. Some were dyed with pigments, manganese, black, ochre, red, maybe even white chalk. These weren't survival tools, they were decoration. Why decorate? Because identity mattered, because beauty mattered. Because even when life was short, cold, and claw-marked, the desire to express something more never disappeared. They also created structure in their spaces. In one cave, archaeologists discovered carefully stacked circles of broken stalagmites, arranged deep in the dark, too far in for practical use. No fire, no food, just formation. What was it? A shrine, a gathering place, a playground, we don't know. But it was deliberate, and it was beautiful. Now let's talk tools. You've heard of Levallois points, stone blades meticulously shaped for hunting. But some tools were overbuilt, crafted with precision that goes beyond function. Some had handles wrapped in sinew and tar, not just for grip, but for aesthetics. Think about that. Making a tool better than it needs to be. Just because it feels good in the hand or looks pleasing to the eye. That's design thinking. That's craftsmanship. And some of those tools were passed down, worn smooth by multiple owners, a kind of inheritance, maybe even heirlooms. Neanderthal children likely learned to nap flint from parents or elders. It wasn't instinctual, it was taught. Skills passed from hand to hand, story to story. You can almost picture it, a father showing his son how to strike the stone just right, how to listen for the clean flake, how to feel when the blade was done. Not just teaching a task, teaching pride. Music, that's where things get strange. A small bone flute found in Slovenia dated to around 50,000 years ago has precisely spaced holes perfectly tuned. Some believe it's Neanderthal made, others argue it's later. Historians still debate, but imagine just for a second a child blowing breath through that flute, making a sound that echoes through the cave and into the ears of everyone around the fire. Not survival, not warning, just a song. There are signs of rhythm, two grooved stones worn smooth where fingers might have tapped. Ritual percussion, play. We may never know, but even the idea is extraordinary. In a world where predators circled and food was never guaranteed, they made music. Maybe softly, maybe sadly. But they made it. And they cared for symbols. Some Neanderthal burials contain items we still don't fully understand antlers placed just so tools that wouldn't be useful in death pigments smeared over bones. These aren't utility, they're meaning. Meaning created in the face of death. That's not just survival, that's spirituality. Were they religious? Did they believe in gods or spirits? Did they think their dead would wake up somewhere warm with full bellies and no toothaches? Historians argue both sides, but the burials suggest belief in something more than just decay. Even grief leaves traces. In one grave, a woman was buried clutching a small carved object, possibly a charm. In another, flowers were laid around the body, not wild scatterings, chosen blooms, selected with care. That takes time, that takes emotion, that takes love. And if that isn't proof of humanity, what is? Their brains weren't smaller than ours. In fact, in many cases, they were larger, particularly in areas related to vision and bodily control. Their lives were different, yes, but not less. They learned, they adapted, they observed the world not just with fear, but with curiosity. They painted, they made necklaces. They taught their children how to sharpen a blade and how to recognize edible plants. They mourned. They remembered. They made marks on the world that had no purpose except to say we were here. In the next section, we'll zoom in closer not on their creativity, but on the delicate, combustible nature of their social bonds. Because when you live in a group of 20, every whisper, every argument, every decision might mean survival, or something darker. The cave is quiet tonight. Too quiet. Not the peaceful post-dinner kind of quiet. Not the kind where bellies are full and fire crackles and someone hums a soft rhythm while picking seeds from their hair. No. This is a tense quiet, the kind that follows an argument, the kind where eyes avoid each other, where bodies are turned inward, where even the children sense something has shifted. Because in a Neanderthal band where there might be just 15 to 30 individuals, the social atmosphere was as crucial to survival as fire or food. And sometimes it cracked. Let's be clear, Neanderthal groups weren't happy-go-lucky communes. They were tight, complex, emotionally volatile units bound by blood necessity and shared trauma. And when those bonds strained, things got dangerous fast. Historians still debate what Neanderthal leadership looked like. There's no archaeological evidence of chiefs or crowns. No gold, no thrones. Just tools, bones, fire pits, and fracture patterns. But evidence does suggest hierarchy. It probably wasn't formal. It was earned or taken through strength, skill, wisdom, or intimidation. The best hunters, the firekeepers, the ones who knew where to find clean water, or how to make birch tar that really stuck. And with leadership came power. And power always attracts challenge. Some Neanderthal skeletons show repeated trauma, especially in the skull, jaw, and forearms, signs of blocking blows or delivering them. There are shattered cheekbones, healed nasal fractures, and one particularly brutal example of a man with a spear tip still embedded in his ribcage. He survived it for a while. This wasn't predator damage. This was interpersonal. Odd fact, some injuries on Neanderthal women matched defensive wounds, raised arms, crushed fingers, fractured collarbones. Whether these were the result of accidents, hunting, or abuse, we don't know. But let's not assume constant brutality. The same groups that fought also protected. We've seen cases many where individuals with disabling injuries live for years, meaning someone chose to care for them, to feed them, to shield them. So if there was violence, there was also forgiveness. Still, in small, close-knit communities, every relationship mattered. If one person soured, it could affect the whole unit. Imagine living with the same 20 people every day of your life. No privacy, no doors, just sleeping bodies, snoring elders, whispering lovers, crying babies, and always, always someone watching you. One wrong glance, one fight over food, one love triangle, it could tear the group apart. And when a group fractured, people died. There are archaeological sites where tools and remains suggest a group simply left mid-season, vanished, scattered, maybe split. Others show mass injuries in multiple skeletons, not predator marks, not disease, just violence. In one case, a cave shows signs of a massacre. Skulls cracked from behind, fire pit overturned, bones strewn. Whether it was an attack from another band or infighting that went too far, we can't be sure. But the outcome is chilling. Now think about exile. If you became a problem, if you endangered the group through recklessness, violence, or simply being too weak, there might not have been a discussion. Just a silent morning where no one woke you. No one gave you food. No one looked back when they left. Imagine that. The fire gone, the cave empty, the air still cold. You were now alone in a world that demanded groups. Alone meant no shared warmth, no hunters to bring you meat, no firekeeper to nudge you awake, no one to hold a spear while you slept. You might last a few days, if you were lucky. Still, despite the risk of fracture, most Neanderthal groups held together. Because cooperation wasn't optional, it was the only thing standing between the group and starvation. They divided labor loosely, not rigidly. The strong hunted, the careful skinned, the elderly taught, the young learned by mimicking. And though there's no evidence of written language, they must have had some form of communication. Gestures, grunts, eye contact, maybe vocal tones that carried meaning across the ridge. You don't drive a mammoth herd into a kill zone without teamwork. And that means trust. Their camps were small, their shelters modest, but their survival depended on invisible threads. Webs of loyalty, resentment, love, duty, and habit. You shared everything. There was no privacy, no my space, Your warmth was your neighbor's warmth. Your food was your sister's milk supply. Your pain, if you let it show, was everyone's burden. But also their warning. One of the most remarkable things about Neanderthal society is how consistently they stayed together. Not for comfort, for continuity. Some groups lasted for generations in the same valley, returning to familiar caves, reusing fire pits, even burying their dead in the same shallow recess. That's not just function, that's belonging. They may not have had a word for home, but they had a sense of it. They had memory, familiar faces, stories told through gesture and repetition, tools passed from elder to child, places where grandmother once warmed hides, where a brother once danced with a wolf pelt on his back. Historians believe Neanderthal bands were often made of extended family siblings, cousins, grandparents, but they may have also welcomed outsiders, especially during mating season. Genetic studies suggest some level of mobility between groups, but that too is fraught. Approaching a new band could mean alliance or ambush. Imagine walking into a clearing, palms open, holding out a rare stone blade as a gesture of goodwill, hoping the strangers across the fire see you, not as threat or prey, but as potential, as kin, because in the Neanderthal world, kin wasn't always about blood. It was about shared fire, shared danger, shared silence. And sometimes it was about choosing to let someone stay, or choosing to leave someone behind. In the next section, we'll step back into that silence, the kind that follows a death. We'll explore how Neanderthals honored their dead. The rituals, the burials, the lingering flowers pressed into ancient stone. And what all of it says about a people who refused to forget. The fire burns lower tonight, not because there's no fuel, but because no one tends it. Everyone's sitting still. No one is talking. The child closest to the flame isn't playing with the tools like he usually does. The oldest woman hasn't moved in hours. There's something laid out on the earth beside the fire, covered in hide, tucked in with care. Someone has died, and the Neanderthals are mourning. Yes, mourning. Not just discarding, not just walking away, but honoring. Because death for Neanderthals wasn't the end of usefulness. It was something else. Something worth ritual, worth memory, maybe even worth beauty. Historians still debate the purpose of Neanderthal burials, whether they believed in an afterlife or simply wanted to protect the body from scavengers. But again and again we find evidence that they didn't treat death as a random biological event. They treated it as a moment that meant something. Let's begin with Shanidar. Deep in the Zagros mountains of northern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered the remains of multiple Neanderthals in a single cave. One of them, known as Shanidar IV, was laid in a shallow pit, arms curled near the chest head, slightly tilted, deliberately positioned, and the earth around him infused with ancient pollen. Clusters of pollen from at least 8 different species of wildflowers. Flowers that bloomed at different times of the year, collected, carried and placed gently around the body. Not blown in by the wind, not scattered by chance. Arranged with purpose. Imagine that. A group trekking across a hillside, stooping in silence to gather blossoms. Yellow, blue, violet. Picking stems still sticky with dew. Then walking slowly back to the cave, holding them not for food, but for him. Maybe he was a leader, or a healer, or simply someone they loved. Maybe he told the best stories by the fire. Maybe he was someone's father. But whoever he wasn't left behind. He wasn't fed to predators or stripped of his tools. He was buried, with care and with flowers. Odd fact. Some of the flowers found in Shanidar's grave had medicinal properties. Anti-inflammatories, antiseptics. So were they placed for healing, for symbolism, for love. We don't know, but the act speaks louder than the explanation. And Shanidar wasn't the only one. Across Europe, from France to Spain to Russia, Neanderthal burials show similar patterns. Shallow pits dug with tools, bodies positioned carefully, grave goods nearby, flint blades, antlers, pigments, even animal bones placed like offerings. One child in France was buried with a necklace of fox teeth, another in Italy with a carved stone pendant. A man in La Chapelle-aux-Saints was laid to rest with his arms folded over his chest. Beside him, a large stone hand axe, not useful in death, symbolic. In some sites, multiple family members were buried together, not tossed in. Placed, layer by layer, like a memory map of who they had been. A record, a story. told not with words, but with bone and stone and gesture. And what does that mean? It means they remembered. It means they grieved. You don't bury the dead to forget them. You bury them to keep them, to mark their place, to know where they are even after they're gone. And that's a profoundly human instinct, even if the word funeral didn't exist. Even if no one cried in the way we understand crying, the emotion, whatever form it took, was there. You can see it in the way the bodies are cradled, in the offerings placed just so, in the pollen scattered like a soft blooming goodbye. These weren't just corpses. These were ancestors, companions, pieces of the group whose absence would be felt. And the rituals weren't just for the dead. They were for the living. They gave meaning, closure, a way to gather around a shared fire and remember that once this person breathed here too. Historians still debate whether Neanderthals believed in an afterlife. But if you've ever traced your fingers across a gravestone or left a flower on a grave or whispered goodbye when no one else was around, then you already understand them. Because they did that too. Maybe not in the same way, but in their way. And the burial wasn't the end of the story. In some sites, there's evidence that graves were revisited, tools added later, pigments refreshed, even food left behind. A kind of prehistoric memorial. A grave that lived with the group's memory, where they came back not out of obligation, but longing. Imagine a child kneeling beside a shallow grave, holding a tool they made, laying it beside the bones of a father who once taught them how to shape stone. Not because it's useful, because it's his, because it's what he would have wanted. This isn't fantasy, it's archaeology, and it tells a quiet truth. Neanderthals weren't just brutes or beasts. They were people who loved and lost, who honored their dead, who couldn't stop death but refused to let it erase the person entirely. And in a world so brutal, so cold, so relentlessly violent, that refusal, that's everything. In the next section, the story changes again because someone new is coming. Not a predator, not a storm, but us. Homo sapiens, modern humans, cousins, rivals, maybe lovers, maybe killers. What happened when our ancestors stepped into Neanderthal lands? We're about to find out. There's a strange silence on the ridge today. It's not the hush of snowfall or the solemn quiet after a successful hunt. It's a silence with weight. The kind that follows change. The kind that makes your skin tingle even before you know why. Because down in the valley, there are strangers. Not predators, not prey. People, but not your people. These new figures move differently. Their clothes are finer, their spears are longer, their voices when they call out across the rocks carry a different rhythm. Their tools flash with unfamiliar shapes. Their hair is woven. Their footprints leave narrower impressions in the snow. These are not Neanderthals. They are humans, Homo sapiens. And for the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals are no longer alone. That moment when two branches of humanity first locked eyes is one of the great mysteries of prehistory. Did they fight? Flee, speak, laugh, we don't know. What we do know is that nothing would be the same again. Because from the moment Homo sapiens entered Europe around 45,000 years ago, the clock started ticking on the Neanderthals. Let's break it down. Neanderthals had dominated Eurasia for over 300,000 years. From the damp forest of Germany to the sun-bleached caves of Spain, they had hunted, survived, and evolved. Their lives were harsh, but they were well adapted. Their tools were strong, their bodies were powerful, their minds were sharp. Then came us. Homo sapiens didn't look dramatically different, just a bit taller, a bit leaner. But we brought something that would change the rules of the game. Innovation. Where Neanderthals had stone spear points, Homo sapiens introduced composite tools. Weapons with multiple materials, stone, wood, sinew glue. Where Neanderthals had close-range thrusting spears, humans had projectiles, spear throwers, and later bows. That meant hunting from a distance, less risk, more reward. We also brought complex social structures. While Neanderthal groups tended to stay small and tight around 15 to 30 individuals, human groups formed wider networks. Trade routes, alliances, information shared across miles. And our art exploded. Cave paintings, carvings, bone flutes, jewelry, ornaments made not just for function but expression, symbols that carried meaning beyond the practical. Neanderthals had started these things too. But humans scaled them up, spread them, wove culture into every fiber of survival. So what happened when the two groups met? Historians still debate it. There's evidence of contact, and not just hostile. Because surprise, we didn't just fight. We mated. That's right, modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. This wasn't a one-time accident. It happened often enough that today almost all non-African people carry Neanderthal DNA. Your nose, your hair, your immune system. If you're European or Asian, there's a chance some part of it comes from a Neanderthal ancestor. Odd fact, one Neanderthal gene helps modern humans better regulate blood clotting. Another affects how we respond to sunlight. Some of our immune defenses came directly from their ancient immune systems. So yes, we absorbed each other. But also yes, we competed. Because peaceful interactions didn't erase the brutal logic of survival. Resources were limited. And in that Ice Age world, there was no spare land. No extra herds of mammoth. If Homo sapiens moved into a region, Neanderthal groups had to move out or be pushed. We don't find battlefield skeletons, but we do see patterns of replacement. A cave where Neanderthals lived for centuries suddenly shows signs of Homo sapiens. Layers of ash change, tool types shift, animal bones are cut differently, and the Neanderthals are simply gone. Were they driven out, starved out, blended in? All of the above. In some cases, it might have been a slow fade. A few humans arrive, they share fire, exchange tools, take mates. Over generations, the groups merge. In others, it might have been swift. A confrontation, a raid, a loss too great to recover from. Neanderthals didn't disappear overnight. They clung on for thousands of years. In Spain, in Gibraltar, in the mountainous edges of their shrinking world, holding on to memory, to family, to tradition. But the pressure never let up. Climate change didn't help. As ice sheets advanced and retreated with ferocity, hunting grounds vanished. Rivers shifted, game migrated, and smaller isolated Neanderthal groups couldn't keep up. Genetic studies suggest that by the end, Neanderthal populations were suffering from inbreeding. Their numbers dwindled, their resilience faltered, and Homo sapiens, we just kept spreading. One tool site, one family group, one migration at a time. So let's imagine one of those final encounters. You're a Neanderthal elder, your beard dusted with snow, your joints aching with years of crouching by fires and sharpening flint. You hear a noise in the woods' footsteps, but not animal. Then a figure appears, slender, quick, with bone jewelry around their neck, a face that looks like yours but not quite, a voice that sounds like a song with different notes. They offer you something, a blade shaped in a way you've never seen, or food wrapped in leather, or simply a smile. And for a moment, you wonder, is this the end of your people, or the beginning of something new? Because extinction doesn't always come with an explosion. Sometimes it comes with an embrace. The last Neanderthals didn't go out in a blaze of battle. They faded into the landscape, into the gene pool, into the quiet recesses of human memory. In some caves, Neanderthal tools are found beside human ones, not scattered, but layered. Evidence of occupation, not destruction. They were here. And then they weren't, but their echoes remain in our bodies, in our minds, in our desire to hold on, to make meaning, to remember. Because what Neanderthals gave us wasn't just genetic code. It was the template for what it means to be human under pressure, to survive, to adapt, to reach for connection even across boundaries we didn't understand. In the next section, we follow their final footprints into the caves of Gibraltar, into the shadows of extinction, and into the silence that followed the last Neanderthal breath. Picture this, a rocky shoreline in southern Spain. The sea crashes nearby, the salt tank hanging heavy in the air. Inside a small, shallow cave, a group of Neanderthals huddles around a dwindling fire. Their clothes are patched hides, their cheeks are drawn. The children are quiet, too quiet. This is the edge of the world, and the edge of their time. Gorham's Cave, Gibraltar. One of the last places where Neanderthals lived before the final flicker of their presence vanished from the earth. Archaeologists believe they survived here up to around 28,000 years ago, thousands of years after they disappeared from most of Europe. But survival at the edge wasn't triumph, it was exhaustion. Everywhere else, their kind was already gone. The northern hunting grounds claimed by modern humans, the inland caves abandoned. The forests they once knew by scent and memory changed. Scarce, dangerous. These last bands were isolated, fragmented. Each year their numbers thinned, their fire circles grew smaller, their tools grew cruder, their songs, if they still sang, grew softer. Historians still debate what finally broke them. Climate competition, genetics, disease. Or maybe it wasn't one thing. Maybe it was everything. Let's start with debris genetics. By the final millennia, Neanderthal populations had dwindled to a dangerous low. Small groups interbreeding generation after generation led to what scientists call a genetic bottleneck. And when that happens, problems follow. Weaker immune systems, lower fertility, developmental disorders, babies born too soon, infants that didn't survive the week, adults who aged faster, bones that didn't heal, minds that faltered. Odd fact, some late Neanderthal remains show signs of vitamin deficiencies like rickets caused by poor diets and lack of sunlight. That's not how you survive a changing world. Then there was climate. The Ice Age wasn't just cold, it was unstable. Temperatures swung violently from decade to decade. Forests turned to tundra. Rivers froze or dried. Herds moved unpredictably. You couldn't count on anything, not the berries in the spring, not the mammoths in the fall. Imagine building a strategy for survival only to have the rules change every few years. And our competition? It never stopped. Homo sapiens were everywhere now, better connected, better equipped. They had language that moved ideas quickly, trade networks that spread innovations, social bonds that reached beyond family, and crucially, they had more babies. More humans meant more pressure on food, on land, on safety. Neanderthals couldn't match it. And what about the culture? There's something deeply haunting about the way Neanderthal artifacts changed in their last few thousand years. Where once there were elegant tools carefully flaked and shaped, now there are rough shards. Once beautiful blades become mere wedges. Decorations vanish, burials become simpler. It's like memory itself was failing. The knowledge of how to knap flint properly, how to tan hide, how to hunt in teams. Not lost in war, but lost in whispers. Because when your best toolmaker dies and there's no one left to teach the craft, it ends. When the last storyteller forgets the beginning of the song, the chorus never comes. It wasn't just extinction, it was a slow forgetting. One group loses a tradition, another misplaces a migration route. A third stops burying their dead with ochre and flowers, and suddenly, across a generation or two, what was once a people with structure and rhythm becomes a group surviving day to day, just trying to stay warm. And yet, even here at the end, there were glimmers of who they had been. In Gibraltar, footprints pressed into ancient mud still remain. A child walked there, not stumbled, walked. Not all was despair. Some still loved, still raised families, still laughed quietly, maybe but real, still made fire, still taught their children the names of animals, the scent of weather, the difference between the call of a bird and the sound of something hungry. Maybe they watched the waves roll in, watched stars rise, wondered what came next. And then, nothing. There is no grave for the last Neanderthal. No marker, no warning. Just an absence. A cave with no soot. A fire pit with no embers. A blade dropped in the dust, never reclaimed. The last breath of a species that had weathered 300,000 years of ice and ash and blood and brilliance, snuffed out not with a roar, but with a whisper. And yet, they didn't vanish entirely. Because they're still in us, in your DNA, in your fingers, in the way your body copes with cold, in the curve of your nasal bone, in the way you remember. You carry them. You are them. And not just genetically. Every time you mourn, bury, hold a child close, hum near a fire, walk the woods, and try to notice, you're speaking their language. You're keeping something alive that they began. Because they weren't brutes. They weren't monsters. They were us. Flesh and fear, bone and breath, wonder and warning. And they endured. Until they couldn't. In the next section, we'll step back from extinction and look forward into inheritance, how Neanderthal genes live on in modern humans. How their story didn't end, it evolved. And how in every act of survival, there's a piece of them still burning quietly within us. You're lying in bed now, maybe beneath a blanket of soft cotton or plush fleece. Your room is quiet. You might hear the hum of a fan, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional creak of your home settling into night. Now imagine that comfort didn't exist. Imagine instead you're sleeping on stone. The air bites at your cheeks, your breath curls visibly into the darkness. The fire's glow is fading, and the ache in your shoulder, old and familiar, keeps you from drifting too deeply. Around you, others murmur in their sleep shift, beneath furs still damp from the last melt. You are a Neanderthal, and this may be your last night. Not because of illness or attack, but because of time. You are the end of something that once stretched across an entire continent. For over 300,000 years, your people survived. Through volcanic winters, roaring lions, mammoth stampedes, and endless hunger, they endured, adapted, cared, loved, fought. But now, as the climate shifts violently and strangers move through your old valleys with strange voices and sharper tools, something heavier than the coal settles in your chest, the quiet understanding that your kind is vanishing. And the land somehow knows it too. Let's return to that land, to the places where the last Neanderthals walked, where the final sparks of their fire lit the cave walls one last time. We begin with Gibraltar, specifically Gorham's Cave, a yawning mouth of stone facing the sea. Archaeological layers here reveal occupation by Neanderthals as recently as 28,000 years ago. That's thousands of years after they'd already disappeared from the rest of Europe. This wasn't a flourishing hub of culture, it was a holdout, a final whisper of a once proud people. The campfires burned lower. The tools grew simpler. The groups grew smaller. It's as if the world itself was slowly dimming around them. Historians still debate what sealed their fate, but the answer isn't one thing, it's a tangle of threads tightening slowly year after year. First, the climate. The last glacial period was not consistent. It swung between bitter cold and brief false thaws. These weren't seasons you could prepare for, they were betrayals. Forests vanished in a generation. Rivers turned to ice or mud or memory. Prey disappeared. Migration patterns collapsed. If you'd learned as a child that the reindeer would return to the valley each spring, only to find it barren and silent as an adult, you would know what it meant to lose more than food. You'd lost the rhythm of survival. And Neanderthals didn't have vast networks to warn them. No scouts from 200 miles away bringing news. No backup groups coming to share knowledge. Each band lived close to the ground, to memory, to tradition. And when those failed, they had nowhere to turn. Second, population. By their final centuries, Neanderthal numbers had dwindled to dangerous lows. Some estimates suggest only a few thousand remained across all of Eurasia. Isolated, fragmented, genetic bottlenecks formed, inbreeding became common. And with it came a decline in reproductive health immunity resilience. A population that can't replenish itself is like a fire with no fuel. The embers glow, then fade, then vanish into ash. Third, competition. Because while Neanderthals were waning, someone else was rising. Homo sapiens had spread across Europe, bringing not just numbers but new methods. Projectile weapons, long-range hunting, larger social networks, trade, and crucially more children. It wasn't a war. Not in the way we think. There's no great battle on record. No valley painted with blood. But there was pressure. More humans meant less land, less prey, more disruption. And even if Neanderthals and humans shared information or even families, the scale was tilted. One group grew, the other dwindled. And then there's a fourth force, quieter, more insidious. Loss of memory. This is perhaps the most heartbreaking. In their final sites, Neanderthal tools begin to degrade, not in materials but in craftsmanship. Where once blades were meticulously flaked and symmetrical, now they're clumsy. Where once complex tar adhesives were used to have tools, now we find raw wood and stone. It's as if they forgot how. But how can an entire people forget their own survival strategies? Because memory lives in people, in elders, in teachers, in parents showing a child how to chip flint just so. When those elders die, when those parents vanish, so too does the skill. And when every day becomes a desperate scramble for calories, there is no time to teach what isn't immediately useful. So knowledge slips. It's not abandonment. It's erosion, like water washing away carvings on stone stroke by stroke. And that brings us to their last moments. Imagine a small group, maybe just a few families, living in the shelter of a limestone cave above the sea. The waves crash below, steady and uncaring. A boy sharpens a broken spearhead while his mother stares into the fire. An elder hums softly to herself in the shadows, her voice almost drowned by the wind. They eat less, speak less. Their clothes are mended too many times. They know the stories, but fewer now. The children don't remember where the herds used to go. The youngest has never seen a mammoth. One morning, they wake to find the fire's gone cold. Maybe no one had the strength to tend it. Maybe the wind smothered it. Maybe the last person who knew how to start one is gone. So they wrap their furs tighter, eat the last of the dried meat, step out into a world that doesn't remember them. And then, nothing. There's no Neanderthal tomb. No grand farewell. Just the last echoes of footsteps fading into the salt spray. A fire ring buried by dust. A flint tool wedged beneath a rock never retrieved. Odd fact. Some of the last Neanderthal sites also show signs of Homo sapiens nearby. Overlapping occupation, maybe contact, maybe peace. Maybe someone picked up that unfinished tool and used it again. In a way, maybe that was the burial, the continuation. Because even though the Neanderthals are gone, they didn't disappear entirely. They left fingerprints on us. About 2% of your DNA, if you're of non-African ancestry, comes from them. Genes that help you fight disease, regulate your sleep, feel the cold. Traits that echo down through millennia like whispers in your blood. Some of the ideas we think of as human mourning ritual symbolic thought were theirs first. And now, they're ours. The Neanderthals may have faded from the world, but they endure every time you look at a fire and feel comfort. Every time you mark a grave. Every time you tell a story in the dark to feel less alone. They survived. Not through territory, not through conquest, but through inheritance. And in the final part, we'll let them rest. Gather everything they left behind, bone tool, whisper gene, and carry it forward with us. Their story ends, but not in silence. The cave is empty now. There's a faint print where a fire once burned blackened ash beneath layers of silt. A few broken flint flakes lie scattered nearby, dulled by time and frost. Farther in, a stone scraper rests exactly where it was dropped untouched for 40,000 years. There are no footprints, no breath, no voices. The last Neanderthal's gone. No one saw them take their final steps. No one marked the moment with ceremony or song. They didn't know they were the last, that the line of their people, thousands of generations strong, was about to vanish into the long night of history. They simply went quiet. And yet they left everything behind. Bone and stone, fire and ash. Memory pressed into the genome of the species that followed. Us. We the ones who came after. Who slept in the same caves, who picked up their tools, who learned to strike the same sparks, who buried our dead in the same earth. We carried them forward without even realizing it. And now so many millennia later we begin to see them clearly. Not as brutish caricatures or side notes in a textbook, but as people. People who loved, who suffered, who protected their children, who mourned their elders, who sat beside the fire and stared at the same stars we still see today. They weren't perfect. They were afraid. They made mistakes. They fought. They bled. But they endured for over 300,000 years. Through climate chaos, through predators with saber teeth and claws the size of scythes, through starvation, infection, injury, and isolation, longer than every recorded human civilization combined, longer than our empires, our kingdoms, our wars, our science. They survived not because they conquered the world, but because they knew how to move through it together. And in their final act of endurance, they gave us themselves. Not just their genes, though we carry those, but their instinct to gather around warmth, their habit of watching the wind, their quiet awe in the face of a dying fire. We inherited their strength. We inherited their sorrow. And oddly their hope. Because buried beneath the stone and ice and silence, we find traces of care, of color, of order, of meaning. That's the legacy of the Neanderthals. Not extinction, but transformation. So the next time you walk under the stars and feel small, remember you are not alone in that feeling. A long time ago, another human stood in the dark, heard wolves howling, held their child close, wondered about tomorrow, and survived just long enough to pass that wondering on to you. And maybe as you finally drift off tonight, you'll feel it not fear but connection, not loneliness but lineage. Because the last Neanderthal isn't gone. They're still here, in your bones, in your breath, in your dreams, So now as the last echoes of our story fade into the hush of your room, take a slow breath. Let it fill your chest gently. Exhale. And imagine a fire flickering low in a cave far away and long ago. The people who sit around it aren't that different from you. They're tired. They're watching the flames dance. They're wondering what comes next. The brutal life of the Neanderthals was not a story of failure. It was a story of astonishing resilience, of tenderness in the face of endless hardship, of people who didn't just survive, they cared. They stood against cold that killed without warning. They faced beasts we only read about now, with nothing but wooden spears and fire. They lost children, they buried their dead with flowers, they endured, and they did all of it without knowing whether their line would continue, whether anyone would remember. But we do, now we do. Every fire we build, every time we grieve, every time we create meaning in a hard world, we echo them. Let that comfort you. Let it soften the weight on your chest. Let it slow your heart. The world is quieter now, safer, but you're still part of a great aching, beautiful story that stretches back farther than memory. And the people who walked before you barefoot, bleeding brave left you something you'll never lose. So close your eyes. The cold can't reach you tonight. The predators are long gone. The fire is still warm. And you are the dream they never knew they'd have.